So why is biodiversity important for the economy?
Well, biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. And an ecosystem could be a lake, it could be a patch of forest, it could be a mangrove forest, it could be a coral reef, it could be grazing land. And all these ecosystems are supplying us with goods and services. Many of these services we can't see, we can't hear, all the stuff in the soils, for example. And yet they are goods and services, and we don't pay for them. Now, the biodiversity is important because it's a characteristic of ecosystems, as I mentioned, but there is a deep sense in which biodiversity enhances the productivity of these ecosystems. That is, their ability to supply us with the goods and services that we enjoy. Now, of course, they're not supplying it to us. We are just new around here, only 300,000 years or so, right? But we do make use of it. They're essential. We wouldn't exist without them. So biodiversity enhances the productivity of ecosystems. It's almost like trust in a society enhances the productivity of that society if people trust one another. So it's a very delicate issue. That's why it's important.
Why should governments be interested in biodiversity or the economic aspect of biodiversity?
Right. Well, I would rephrase the question by asking, why should governments be particularly interested in biodiversity? They are, after all, interested in road building, and they have all sorts of regulations about what kind of houses you can construct, buildings you can construct, and so forth, and rightly so too. So they're involved with other types of capital assets as well. But here it's very particularly important because a lot of these services don't have markets. So there's gigantic institutional failure, starting with markets as institutions. For reasons that are not very difficult to understand, nature is mobile, she moves. So what you do here transmits itself to a distant part of the world through the air or water, and it could be damaging. And it lasts, so it affects future people as well. And yet we're not charged for it. Take, for example, fishing in the open seas. Nobody pays a rent for the fishery. So we overextend ourselves there. So it's a very natural thing for some central agency to be involved in coordinating and ensuring that these assets are managed well. And when you ask governments, some of these assets need international dealings, not just with national governments, so to speak. So my review goes into these at some detail. The review of the economics of biodiversity that I prepared some year and a half ago goes into these issues in great detail. The responsibility of the household, the responsibility of the community, of the region, of the state, a nation, and the international fraternity, if you like. We all need to be involved in biodiversity protection because we need to have new institutions to be able to avoid the mistakes we have made by not having institutions helping to manage the ecosystem, these assets, nature's assets, natural capital, sometimes we call it. They need protection. They're exposed to excessive use. And of course, you know that as well as I do when we talk about climate change. That's one example of the atmosphere, which is an asset, being run down by too much emission of carbon. But then we have other kinds of degradation that we're involved in, deforestation at a massive rate, which weakens the productivity of many, many ecosystems elsewhere.
if we think like public sector budgets, how would they take into account biodiversity from this real like budget book perspective?
Right. That's a very good question. Again, I wouldn't ask the Ministry of Finance, let's say, or the Treasury in the United Kingdom to start counting the number of species. I wouldn't ask them to look at biodiversity per se. I would ask them to recognize that there are all these assets out there Mother Nature has given us. She is an asset, and that we're mismanaging them. And yet they are all productive, and they're supplying us with goods and services. So we should try and measure the extent to which we're using these goods and services in our economic activities, because they're usually missing. Much of them are missing, actually, because of the reasons I've just now mentioned. There are no markets for them, so they don't get monitored, recorded in national statistics. So in addition to produced capital, buildings, roads, machines, and so forth, for which there are plenty of data that countries have about the extent to which they're investing in it, in addition to human capital, health and education, over which, again, national statistics offer a good deal of information about the quality of the life expectancy, state of health, and so forth. All this is bread and butter economics. What's missing is what we're doing to nature, natural capital. Some of it is included, of course, oil and natural gas. They have prices, and so they get included. But what's happening under us in the soils, that doesn't get recorded. So the idea here would be that national statistics ought to try and tease out, with the help of ecologists, agronomists, not just economists, to tease out the productivity of ecosystems. And when we make decisions on investment, we ought to be asking ourselves, where are the best rates of return? Very, very commonplace idea. But if you don't price nature, if you don't value nature, then the rate of return on investment in nature is very low. Which is why, of course, we're in the state that we are in. We have invested a lot in produced capital and human capital, certainly in Europe, for example, North America. We're doing very well that way. But we've done that at the expense of running down natural capital. And we need the institutions to be able to organize the data so that finance ministries, banks, in particular when they lend, they ought to be able to do real rate of return calculations and lend to the higher productivity objects, investments, that is. And many of them will be natural capital because, of course, if you have run down one class of capital assets, as we have, then you can imagine that the return on regenerating them will be very high, as opposed to something which is doing very well anyway and you've got lots of it. Okay. So yes, it needs to become now commonplace. Nature should enter ministries of finance as capital assets. Investment projects should be screened for their effect on nature. Investing in nature might simply be to leave nature alone. So if a wetland has deteriorated, you then say, well, we're going to leave the wetland alone and wait for her to recover, because then she becomes more productive in terms of being a habitat for pollinators, cleaning water by natural means. And all these are goods that we enjoy, but we don't value.
What could be the role of supreme audit institutions as government external auditors? What would be your advice? What could we do in order to integrate this thinking?
Well, I think the sooner we move in the direction that I'm suggesting, which is to regard ecosystems as capital assets, then many things fall into place. The auditors review public expenditure in health, education, road building, local public goods, national public goods and so forth. And they want to see whether they jive with government promises. And they want to, if they're good auditors, they will also be looking for as to whether the returns were adequate. Was it advisable investment? And if not, maybe we ought to change our investment portfolio. Now it should include natural capital. All the forests that you have got here, the lakes that you have, they supply you with huge numbers of goods. Lakes aren't just for fishing and entertainment. They provide a background for enormous amount of services that we all enjoy here. So that requires of us to think of ecosystems as I said, assets, and try and understand the factory that is that ecosystem. I mean, a lake is a factory. It's churning out services, okay? I know it sounds odd, but it is a factory. And we need to understand these processes. And ecologists do, up to a point, obviously. But we economists have really ignored it. So it is really essential that it enters. Now, interesting, my own experience of my review has been that the private sector has been particularly interested in the review. And I've often wondered why, and I've asked them. And here is one of their answers. They're worried that ecosystems at the source of their supply chain, say African ecosystems, you're importing timber, you're importing cocoa, you're importing primary products from poor countries, which are rich in biodiversity, okay? And if you don't care about them, then your supply chain is likely to suffer because they're the beginnings of it. And when ecosystems there suffer, it means that the profit level of the importing company is under threat. So they worry about, at least those who have talked to, worry about the fact that risk is increasing. Now here's the problem, another problem, which is these risks are related to one another. Because what happens to a grassland will affect the neighboring forest. What happens to the forest affects the neighboring grassland, and then affects, in turn, the agricultural land next to it. Okay, these are interconnected. So if one of these ecosystems gets threatened, the others are threatened as well. And now you may be importing from one group of services. Somebody else is importing from another group of services. And if they are related to one another, then the profitabilities are going to move in tandem. If one gets destroyed, the others go down. So insurance markets are not going to work very well either. So we need alternative institutional mechanisms. One way of doing it, as my review suggests, is to make disclosure of how a company is treating its supply chain, disclose the entire supply chain, what's happening along the way. Though companies do that now for food because we all care about what we eat. So when you buy something from a supermarket, it gives you a whole list of things telling you what the ingredients are. Now, why are they doing it? Well, they're doing it because, at least initially, otherwise we wouldn't buy. We would just, if they're not disclosing, how do I know if they're unhealthy? And then, of course, you may make it mandatory. And then, of course, all the firms gain from that fact. And something like that is probably needed now, about that we consumers, if we get worried about the states of the biosphere, what we're doing to her, we could insist firms disclose what they're doing right across their supply chain. In the sense, are they paying enough? Are they investing in the primary products that and if so, how are they doing it? And so forth. Are they being short? Are they using too high a discount rate? Because that matters. Then we might say it doesn't matter what happens to that ecosystem in 10 years' time because I'll be able to reap a lot of profits now. So disclosure can be a very good disciplinary mechanism, which benefits everybody, including the firms, by the way. Okay.
Final question. How do you see the relationship between climate and biodiversity, this so-called twin crisis?
Yeah, well, it's again a very good question. They're deeply related. The climate to biodiversity is pretty clear. Okay, that's pretty obvious. I mean, if the summers get very hot, and then there'll be a huge relocation of species, and many species will die. Okay, so that part is, I think, clearer. The reverse is also should be clear. Suppose you were to deforest the Amazon. And that'll be a huge loss of biodiversity, but it'll also simultaneously change the entire wind system, at least in that part of the hemisphere. And then, of course, you'll have effects elsewhere. So the climate system will be affected. So these two are very, very deeply connected. I think it's most useful to think of climate regulation. I don't mean government regulation. I mean nature's regulation of the climate, that service that we have enjoyed for so many thousands of years, a regular climate, a dependable climate, so to speak, the last 10,000 years or so. That's only one service that Mother Nature offers. I've been talking about many of the other services that I've just named. I mean, one of them is seed pollination is a service. Decomposition of waste is another. It's a huge service. Organisms die, and then they get recycled. That recycling process is an incredibly important service, because if there wasn't that recycling, of course, the whole place would be like a cow dung all over the place. All right. I'm being colorful now, but the idea, you can see why it's important. So Mother Nature offers a huge number of services, bewilderingly. Many of them we don't even know what they are until we detect the problem, and then we say, oh my gosh, that was this service that she was giving us, and we ignored it. So in a way, I feel that we shouldn't think in terms of climate and biodiversity. I know we need some focal points for public discourse, and it's good to think of these two as twin pillars. But really, we have multiple pillars. Climate is one. Climate regulation is one service. Pollination is another service. Decomposition of waste is another service. Nitrogen fixation is yet another service, and so forth. And these services are provided by ecosystems. And so I come back to the point that we ought to be thinking of ecosystems as assets, and we have to ask after the health of these systems. Are they productive? It's almost like a medical term, and ecologists very often talk in terms of this, use expressions like, gosh, this wetland looks very unhealthy. By that they mean that it's not doing all the stuff that you might expect a wetland to perform, which we all enjoy. And it's rich in biodiversity is a symptom of it being healthy. And if biodiversity were lost, it would not be able to do all the things it does. So that's the way I think we ought to be thinking about these issues. And I think it's all right to think in terms of biodiversity and climate change as being the twin things. If it concentrates our mind, that's fantastic. But ultimately, we ought to be thinking of nature. That's it. That's Mother Nature. She needs looking after.